It's been a few months since that night. I'm not sure when everything became so clear to me, but somewhere along the way I finally stopped asking myself, why did this happen? And started asking, what now? I knew I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the mistakes I'd made. But I could still do something with the wreckage of my life. The days that followed Ethan's departure were a blur of shame, confusion, and self-loathing. My mind kept replaying everything I'd done. Every mocking comment, every time I took him for granted. I couldn't stop seeing the hurt in his eyes. I couldn't forget how he'd packed my things and told me to leave, how he'd walked out of that house without looking back. It was like a scene from a movie, except this was my reality, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever faced. I tried calling him at first, texted him a lot. I begged him to talk to me. I wanted him to see that I wasn't the person I'd been. But he never responded. And as hard as it was to admit, part of me understood. How could he trust me again? How could he look at me the same way when I had torn him down so completely? I spent a lot of time in my parents' house just thinking. I had no friends now. Tina and the others, the ones who had always been there, egging me on, encouraging my behavior, had all disappeared. Not a single one reached out after that night. And honestly, that hurt almost as much as losing Ethan. I thought they were my people, but it turns out they were just feeding into my worst impulses. They weren't true friends. It's funny how quickly people can turn on you when things go wrong. But as much as it stung, I had to face the truth. I was alone in this. I couldn't blame anyone else for the mess I had created. It was all on me. I had pushed everyone away, including the one person who had loved me without condition. Ethan was gone, and there was no one left but myself to pick up the pieces. After a week or two of wallowing in self-pity, I finally pulled myself together. I had to. I needed to rebuild my life. The guilt was still there, heavy and constant, but it wasn't going to fix anything. If I wanted a future, I needed to make it happen on my own. My dad helped me find a job. It wasn't much, just a low-paying entry-level position at a local store, but it was something, and it was a start. I didn't have any options at first, but I was grateful to have something to do. It gave me a routine, something to keep my mind occupied, even if I hated it. I couldn't afford to be picky. I needed to prove to myself that I could make it on my own. The job was a wake-up call in a lot of ways. It wasn't glamorous and it was hard work, but it was a step in the right direction. I had to focus on paying my bills, saving money, and figuring out where I was going to live. My parents had given me a roof over my head, but I couldn't stay with them forever. It was time to start building my own independence again. But even with everything I was doing to try to move forward, there were days when the emptiness still crept in. I missed Ethan more than I thought was possible. The house was quieter now. I didn't have anyone waiting for me at the end of the day. There was no one to share a meal with, no one to talk to about how my day went. Even at my parents' house, the loneliness was overwhelming at times. One day, a few weeks after I started the job, I ran into someone from the neighborhood. It was a woman I hadn't really spoken to much when I was with Ethan. She had always been friendly, but I had been too wrapped up in my own world to really notice. She was surprised to see me, and after a brief exchange, she told me something I hadn't expected to hear. My old friends were now trying to get with Ethan. She didn't seem to have any ill will toward me. In fact, she seemed kind of relieved when I told her what had happened between Ethan and me. She wasn't judgmental, just matter of fact, like she saw it coming. It stung, but it also opened my eyes in a way nothing else had. Tina and the others, the people who had encouraged me to belittle Ethan, to take him for granted, were now trying to get into his good graces. It felt like karma, but also like a slap in the face. I had been so convinced that I was the one in control, the one on top, and now these same people were scrambling to get Ethan's attention. I thought about it for a long time, and in the end it didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. I knew Ethan wouldn't want anything to do with them. He wasn't the type to just jump into another relationship, especially with people who had treated him poorly. The old saying, "What goes around comes around," felt pretty true in that moment. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I couldn't be angry. I had let my pride, my insecurities, and my selfish need for validation destroy everything good in my life. I had lost Ethan, and now my friends were showing their true colors. I had no one left but myself. That's when I decided to stop looking back and start focusing on what I could control. My future. I kept working at my job, kept saving money, and started looking for a place of my own. It wasn't easy. Some days felt like they stretched on forever. But I kept telling myself that I had to keep moving forward. I wasn't going to let myself fall back into the same cycle of mistakes. I had to learn from this. One of the best decisions I made was starting therapy. I had always been skeptical about therapy, thinking I could handle things on my own, but that was before everything blew up in my face. Talking to a therapist helped me understand why I had acted the way I did. I wasn't just a bad person. I was deeply insecure. I had used my relationships as a way to validate myself, and when that validation stopped coming, I didn't know how to handle it. Therapy gave me the tools to understand my behavior and hopefully change it. Ethan and I haven't spoken since that night. I've reached out a few times, but he's made it clear that he's done. And as hard as it is to accept, I know it's for the best. He's moved on, and I'm not the person he needs anymore. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully atone for the way I treated him, but I've accepted that our relationship is over. What matters now is how I move forward from here. So that's where I am today. Still working at my job, still trying to figure out what comes next. I don't have all the answers and I'm far from where I want to be, but I'm getting there. Slowly. One step at a time. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I've learned the hardest lesson of my life. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure I never make the same mistakes again. To those who have been kind and supportive, thank you. Your words have meant more to me than you'll ever know. To those who have been harsh, well, I get it. I'm not here to make excuses for my behavior. I'm just trying to be a better person. As for Ethan, I hope he's happy. I hope he's found the peace I couldn't give him. He deserves that. And as for me, I'll keep moving forward, even when it's hard. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm going to keep trying. Hi Reddit. I'm using a throwaway account because, frankly, I'm terrified that my husband will find this post, and I'm just too embarrassed. What I'm about to share has been eating me up for a while now, and I need to get it out. I'm not proud of myself, and I'm here not to look for sympathy, but for some guidance. I'm in a mess and I don't know what to do. My name is Maya and I'm 25. My husband's name is Ethan, and he's 27. We've been married for 4 years, and together for over 6. We met in college and got married a couple of years after. Things were good at first, great actually. Ethan is one of the kindest, most thoughtful people I know. He's always put my happiness first. But somehow, somewhere along the way, I took it for granted. We're very different in a lot of ways. Ethan is an introvert. He's quiet, thoughtful, loves reading and watching movies. He's always been content staying in, having a cozy night at home. Meanwhile, I've always been the social butterfly. I love going out, hosting parties, being surrounded by people. I've always been the one organizing get-togethers, and Ethan has always supported me. He didn't mind that I was the life of the party and he wasn't. I always thought I had it all figured out, and Ethan would just go along with it. But looking back now, I see how I took his kindness and patience for weakness. I started pushing boundaries, making jokes about him in front of friends, dismissing his efforts, and acting like he was just there. I didn't realize at the time, but I slowly started losing respect for him. And worse, I didn't care. Ethan was always the one to try harder. He'd surprise me with small gifts, plan romantic dinners, and show me he loved me even when I wasn't giving him much in return. He would drop everything for me no matter what I needed. I just didn't appreciate it. I thought I was the one in control of our relationship. This story didn't happen overnight. It wasn't just one moment that ruined everything, but a series of little things. I started to feel like our marriage wasn't exciting enough. I wanted something more. I didn't want a man who just adored me, who let me have my way all the time. I wanted passion, intensity, someone who could challenge me. But I didn't realize that in my quest for excitement, I was slowly destroying everything Ethan and I had built. Ethan was never the type to stand up for himself, at least not when it came to me. He would always prioritize my feelings, avoid conflict, and bend over backwards to make me happy. I assumed he'd never leave me. I thought I could do whatever I wanted and he would just take it because that's what he always did. I started spending more time with my friends, and the more time I spent with them, the more I distanced myself from Ethan. They didn't understand him, and they certainly didn't understand why he was always so accommodating. In fact, they encouraged me to be more selfish. They'd say things like, "You deserve better than him," Or you should find someone who actually challenges you. They didn't see the things I should have been appreciating. The way he made my morning coffee without asking. How he was always there when I was having a bad day. Or how he never let me feel alone. All they saw was an easy target. A man who would do anything to make me happy. And they convinced me that I deserved someone more on my level. I look back now and I realize how much I took Ethan for granted. I stopped appreciating the little things he did. His gestures, his kindness, his love, all of it started to feel suffocating to me. Instead of being grateful for the life we had, I started resenting him for being too accommodating. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when I began losing respect for him, but I do remember the moment it all began to spiral. Things started to go downhill in ways I didn't even realize at the time. Ethan, as always, was doing everything he could to keep me happy, but I wasn't seeing it anymore. I was too wrapped up in my own world, hanging out with friends who fed my desire for attention, for validation. They didn't care about Ethan. They just thought he was boring, too nice, too willing to let me get away with everything. And I listened. I let them convince me that I was missing out on something better. I wanted excitement. I wanted someone who wouldn't just follow me around, someone who could keep up with my energy and my social life. Around this time I started pulling away more. I told Ethan I wanted to be a stay-at-home wife, even though we didn't have kids yet. At first he was completely on board, wanting to make things easier for me. But that's when I really started slacking off. I'd leave the house a mess, not cook dinner, and just expect Ethan to pick up the slack. He did, of course, but he never complained. He'd come home from a long day at work, tired and drained, and he'd still clean, cook, do everything. And I just let it happen. It's embarrassing to admit now, but I started to resent him for it. He was so accommodating, so eager to please, and all I could think was, this is too easy. I don't want someone who's just going to let me walk all over them. Instead of realizing how much Ethan was doing for me, I began seeing him as weak. Not strong enough to stand up for himself, not exciting enough to keep my attention. I started pulling away even further, finding solace in the company of my friends who just didn't understand what I had at home. They encouraged my behavior, telling me how lucky I was, how I could do better, how Ethan was too whipped. The more I hung out with them, the more I made jokes about Ethan behind his back. I started mocking him for being too nice, for being so devoted to me when I didn't deserve it. My friends would laugh, and for a brief moment I felt good. I felt powerful, like I was in control. But deep down I knew it wasn't right. I just ignored it, convincing myself that Ethan would never leave. He loved me too much. I could treat him however I wanted, and he'd always come back. Ethan noticed, of course. He was too kind to call me out on it, but I could see it in his eyes, the hurt, the confusion. But he never showed it. He'd just smile and say, "I love you, Maya." It felt like he was constantly walking on eggshells around me, always trying to do things to win my affection. But instead of feeling loved, I just felt more detached. I didn't want a husband who tried so hard. I wanted someone who would challenge me, someone who would make me feel alive, not comfortable. And so I kept pushing him away. Things continued like this for months, me drifting further away from Ethan while he clung to the idea that love could fix everything. I kept spending more time with my friends, going out, having fun, while Ethan stayed home as usual. But the worst part wasn't just that I ignored him, it was how I treated him when others were around. My disrespect didn't stop behind closed doors. It spilled out in front of our friends, and that's where I really lost him. One night I invited a few of my college friends over to hang out. I had started reconnecting with them, and honestly I enjoyed their attention. They were everything I thought I wanted: carefree, outspoken, and full of energy. Ethan, ever the peacemaker, cooked for everyone and made sure we had everything we needed while I and my friends drank wine and laughed. I didn't think twice about how this was affecting him. After dinner, with a few too many glasses of wine in me, the conversation shifted to relationships. My friend Kate started talking about her boyfriend, saying he wasn't nearly as devoted as Ethan was to me. That was my cue. I started bragging about how amazing Ethan was, how he did everything for me, and how I could always count on him for anything. It wasn't just praise, it was mocking. I made jokes about how he'd do anything I asked, how I could probably tell him to jump off a cliff and he'd ask me, "How high?" The laughter from my friends felt good. Felt like I was in control. They thought it was hilarious and I loved the validation. But what I didn't see was the look on Ethan's face when he overheard. He was standing in the kitchen, and when I turned to look at him, I saw the hurt in his eyes for the first time in a long time. I could see that he was holding back tears, but he never said anything. He just smiled weakly, said he was glad I was having fun, and left the room. The next morning I tried to act like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the guilt. Ethan, as always, was calm and collected. He made breakfast like he always did and asked how my night was. I could see in his eyes that he was hurting, but he didn't push it. Instead of apologizing, I made up some excuse, brushed him off and went about my day. But inside I felt that nagging feeling. Something was wrong, but I convinced myself that it would blow over like it always had before. A few days later, my friend Tina, the one who'd been encouraging my behavior for months, invited me out for another girls' night. Ethan, always supportive, encouraged me to go, even handed me extra money in case I needed it. That night, as expected, we went to a bar and had a blast. But after a few too many drinks, I let my guard down completely. We ended up making more jokes about Ethan, this time even more cutting, more personal. I mocked him for being too easygoing, for never standing up for himself, for always saying yes to me no matter what. I made the same old jokes about how I could control him, how I was the one running the show. My friends laughed, of course, egging me on, and I felt invincible. But in the back of my mind I knew it was wrong. Ethan didn't deserve this. I knew he was a good man. But I still didn't care. I didn't think it would matter. I thought he'd always be there, forgiving me, letting me get away with everything. And I could see now that I was pushing him farther away each time. The tension between us started to grow thicker after that. Ethan didn't call me out, but he wasn't the same. He was quieter, more distant. He'd retreat into his work, spending long hours on projects and taking on extra shifts just to avoid coming home. I still went out with friends, ignoring the way he was withdrawing. I tried to tell myself that I was just living my life, having fun. But in reality, I was watching the person I loved slowly slip away. And I didn't even know how to stop it. I kept telling myself that Ethan wouldn't leave me. He was too kind, too patient, too forgiving. He'd never leave. But deep down I could feel him slipping through my fingers like sand in the wind. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. Ethan was becoming a shadow of the person he used to be. Quiet, passive, and sad. But every time I saw that, I just pushed him further, thinking that I deserved more. That I needed more. And then, the night of the neighborhood barbecue happened. It was supposed to be just another party, nothing too special. But for us, it turned out to be the breaking point. At the barbecue, Ethan did what he always did. Helped with the grill, made sure everyone had what they needed, and stayed in the background while I spent time with my friends. I was a little tipsy, and the conversation shifted, as it always did, to relationships. Someone asked about Ethan, and I started bragging again. I told them how lucky I was to have someone who did everything for me, who would never question me, who would always put me first. I told everyone how I didn't have to do much because Ethan was always there to take care of me. My friends laughed and I laughed too. It felt good to be the center of attention. But then everything stopped. I looked up, and I saw Ethan standing across the yard. His face was pale, and there was no smile on his lips. He was staring at me, and in that moment I realized that he had heard everything. I froze. The laughter around me went quiet. My stomach dropped. Ethan walked over to me, his face hard, his eyes cold. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The silence felt unbearable, like everything had come to a head. And then he said it. "We need to talk." I felt a rush of panic, but I didn't know how to respond. I tried to laugh it off, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't a joke. He wasn't playing around anymore. "I'm done, Maya," he said, his voice firm. "I'm done being disrespected. I'm done being treated like this. I'm leaving." At first I thought it was just a fight, that he'd come back around like he always did. But when I saw the look on his face, I knew he wasn't going to. He told me to pack my things. He said I wouldn't be coming back to the house, that my things would be outside when I got there. I was stunned, completely blindsided. I tried to follow Ethan, to reason with him, but it was too late. He was already gone, walking out of the backyard, straight through the front door. The entire atmosphere of the party had shifted. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but none of my so-called friends came to my aid. There was no sympathy, no one to comfort me. They didn't care, not really. It felt like I was standing there alone, the weight of everything I had done crashing down on me all at once. I walked back to the house, my mind racing. I could hardly process what had just happened. Ethan was leaving. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and my legs felt weak as I pushed open the door to the house. I found him in the living room packing up my things. The sight of it was surreal. Ethan, the man who had always been there for me, who had done everything to keep our relationship together, was now packing my bags. He moved quickly and methodically, taking no time to hesitate. There was no shouting, no argument, just a quiet, deliberate action that spoke volumes. I couldn't breathe. "Ethan, please don't do this," I begged, stepping toward him. I could hear my voice break as I spoke. "We can work this out. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I was just being stupid. Please don't leave me." He didn't even look at me. His back was turned and he was focused on the task at hand, as if this was the only thing that mattered now. He was packing with such efficiency, as though he had been planning this moment for a long time, though I knew he hadn't. This wasn't his style, but I had pushed him to this point. I had taken him for granted, and now he was done. "Ethan," I said again, my voice trembling, "please, we can fix this." He paused, finally turning around. The hurt in his eyes was undeniable, but there was something else there too. Something cold. Something I hadn't seen in him before. It was like a switch had flipped. The man I knew, the one who would do anything to make me happy, was gone. "You don't get it, Maya. I've been trying for so long," he said, his voice low, almost monotone. "But you've never respected me. Not once. I've given you everything, and you've treated me like a joke. I'm tired of it. I'm done." I felt my heart shatter in my chest. Every word he said pierced me like a knife. This was my fault. He didn't wait for me to say anything else. He finished packing up my things, clothes, a few personal items, and placed them in front of the door. The finality of it all was suffocating. He looked at me, his eyes blank now, like he had already closed the door on our entire relationship. "I'm not going to change my mind. You can't keep treating people like this and expect them to stay." I just stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak. My world was falling apart right before my eyes, and I had no idea how to stop it. After he finished, Ethan walked to the door. "I'm not coming back. Take your stuff and go," he said without emotion. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't make him stay. He was done. In an instant, he was gone. The door closed with a finality I'll never forget. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had just been, and for the first time I realized just how much I had taken him for granted. I thought he would always be there. I thought he was weak, but now I knew the truth. He wasn't weak. He was strong. Stronger than I ever gave him credit for. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by the mess of what had been my life. I grabbed what I could carry and left. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't just stay there anymore. I ended up walking down the street, carrying my bags, my mind completely numb. The people I had once called friends didn't come to help. They didn't come to comfort me. They just watched. I could feel their eyes on me, and it made everything worse. They were watching me lose everything, and I didn't know how to handle it. I made it to a park nearby. I just needed a minute to breathe, to think. I felt completely disconnected from the world. Nothing made sense anymore. That's when I called my dad. When my dad picked me up, he didn't say much. He just looked at me with disappointment in his eyes, but he didn't lecture me. He didn't yell. He just told me, "We'll figure it out, honey." And that was all I needed to hear. My parents, despite everything, were there for me. They took me in, gave me a place to stay, and let me crash at their house. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I knew I wasn't completely alone. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and confusion. I tried calling Ethan multiple times, but he wouldn't answer. I texted him, begging him to talk to me, to give me another chance. But nothing. It was like he had erased me from his life. And I couldn't blame him. I spent most of my time at my parents' house feeling utterly lost. I wanted to fix things with Ethan. I wanted to show him that I could change, that I wasn't the person I had been. But how could I expect him to believe that now? I had pushed him to his breaking point, and now I was paying the price. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to move forward. It took me a few days before I realized that I needed to stop waiting for Ethan to come back. I needed to focus on myself, on rebuilding my life. But the weight of my mistakes was heavy, and every time I thought about it, I couldn't help but feel that ache in my chest. I had messed up, and now I had to find a way to make it right.